And as we reflect on the election outcomes in Zimbabwe, where Emmerson Mnangagwa has been re-elected as president of Zimbabwe after securing 52.6% of the votes, the country's main opposition party is rejecting the results, alleging irregularities and intimidation. Now, the leader of Citizens Coalition for Change, Nelson Chamisa, received 44% of the presidential vote, while the SADC Observer Mission has denounced the polls, saying they violated democratic ideals. To discuss this further, we're joined by Dr. Charles Sinkala, an international relations expert. Dr. Sinkala, good afternoon to you and thank you for joining us. Just your reaction and reflection on the outcome of the elections, whether it was free and fair. We know that there are varying views depending on who you ask on whether the elections were procedurally done according to the Constitution and the book. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, it's very difficult to say the elections were free and fair in Harare in Zimbabwe, due to the fact that we can't forget that Zimbabwe has been sanctioned, and part of the sanctions is the rule of law and the separation of the judiciary and the independence of the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission, and that thing has been highlighted by the report from Dr. Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was the head of the mission of SADC, which he also went further to see in the last elections in terms of the court cases, which were indicated that, these issues has to be tabled out if we are to promote the democratic dispensation in terms of the transitions and having a free and fair elections in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, now that the ZEC has released the election results, we know that the CCC, the official opposition, saying that they're going to take this under review. What outcome is that likely to bring? Or is it just a case of the opposition essentially wanting to reflect what we were saying, that the elections were not free and fair?
Well, Cindy, you and I, we have had this discussion regarding Zimbabwe, I think, way back when you were there in N7, and how the late Morgan Shangirai was refused, the opportunity to participate freely under RG Mugabe when he was head of state, and how the ZANU-PF has actually militarized and made Zimbabwe as a police state. It's very difficult to pursue any legal interest in terms of nullifying the election results in Zimbabwe, for the fact that I mentioned earlier that there's no separation of powers between the judiciary, the arms of government, and as well as the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission, because they've got legs and influence within the ruling party. At the moment, ZANU-PF, like many other analysts and the people have said, like I've seen on the ground, that ZANU-PF is actually surviving to be in power, rather than other opposition political parties in Zimbabwe are fighting for the economical upliftment of the lives of the Zimbabweans.
What does it say that ZANU-PF didn't secure and clear-cut two-thirds majority, and the opposition sitting at just over 40%? Is that maybe a sign of the times that with the more voter education and hopefully even with the voter diaspora being considered, that we could be talking a different dynamic come in 5 years' time after ZANU-PF, or rather in the next elections?
Well, Cindy, it's very difficult in the set of Zimbabwe, even though that those who are in diaspora can be allowed to vote. But the fact that if there's no clear, free and fair playing ground in terms of the elections to give an opportunity to, especially opposition political parties, where violations like what the report from SADC I just went through there has been violated, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, and the other freedoms and the tenants, which are part of the sanctions that Zimbabwe has been given sanctions for the past 21 years, are not put in place. Whether or not they have allowed many people, Zimbabweans, to vote, whether inside Zimbabwe or outside, it won't make a difference, because these irregularities, I think, amounts to rigging elections and not the willful interest of the people of the Zimbabweans to decide which government they will need to form. But in any case, others could have a different view. Like I was very surprised by the former president, Joaquim Chissano from Mozambique, who was criticized the independence and the pre-published report from the SADC to condemn it, without looking at the history and all the reports which has been established in terms of the elections or post and pre-elections in Zimbabwe. In fact, at one stage, the EU observers were actually asked to leave the country, and as well as many other observers who's been to Zimbabwe has been asked to leave the country due to the irregularities which have been going on. So for the fact that these irregularities are not leveling a level ground to provide a free and fair elections, to give an opportunity. And in this case, actually, it was even worse. You could see that they had to run off to the second. They're unprecedented in the history of elections on the continent, especially in the SADC region, where we have enjoyed free and fair elections. They cannot be completely free and fair, but we can see the sense what happened in Zambia. We can see the sense of what happened in Tanzania, Mozambique, and as well as in South Africa there, that at least we can see there's some sanity in terms of conducting these elections.
What does it mean, though, for the people of Zimbabwe, especially in the economic tipping point, one would hope, because that was the promise of Emmerson Mnangagwa when he took over from Robert R.G. At the time, Robert Mugabe, that things would turn around, there would be some form of stability and a revitalization of the economy so that even the expats would be wanting to go back home. What does it mean for Zimbabwean people now?
I think it's very disappointing, Cindy, that Zimbabweans cannot effect the change that they need. Yes, we celebrate ZANU-PF as the liberator of Zimbabwe ever since Zimbabwe attained high independence in 1980. And I think over the time they have lost that shine and sheen. They've made a lot of mistakes than be correcting the economic situations in Zimbabwe, as we can see. Many Zimbabweans, had the feeling that they will effect change. And most of them, I think this time we had a very large turnout. I could see even solidarity companies and organizations, especially from South Africa and elsewhere, had offered to support the Zimbabweans to go back home and make that decision to make a change for their country. Lots of hopes has been lost. Cindy, if I go back to when the ousted former President R.G. Mugabe was ousted, many people thought that they shall have hope from President Emmerson Mnangagwa, but that hope has been losing its traction every time they've gotten elections. In fact, some people have been speaking to here in the capital and elsewhere. They've indicated that, look, what is the point of voting? That when we vote, we don't effect the change that we require. And each time we do it, it doesn't happen. And they will rather just go back to living and be suffering in diaspora, regardless of the conditions. So these are serious issues, and that has to be addressed by government. And I think the international community has to move in. SADC, they are reviewing the response from the government of Zimbabwe, and I'm sure there will be a solution at the end of the day to make sure that this is addressed sooner than later.
All right, Dr. Sinkala, thank you indeed for your time. That's Dr. Charles Sinkala, an independent international relations expert, reporting, or rather engaging with us from Zimbabwe on the back of the elections outcomes of last week, where Emmerson Mnangagwa of the ZANU-PF has retained his position as president of Zimbabwe.